Have you ever wondered what the world might look like if no single power or alliance of nations took charge? If instead every country on the planet acted primarily in its own interest, leaving global problems to drift without a guiding hand? It sounds unsettling, but according to Bremmer, we're already living in that reality, a GZERO world as he calls it. As always, we recommend buying and reading the entire book, Every Nation for Itself, by Bremmer, through the link below, because there's far more in the full text than we can cover here. But let's dive into his main ideas about how this GZERO world came to be, why it persists, and where it's likely to go in the coming years. Buckle up, because we're exploring a geopolitical landscape that's more complicated and maybe more precarious than ever before. Before we dig into specific chapters, let's paint the overall picture. Bremmer's central argument is that the world we inhabit has no clear leader or dominant block of leaders taking charge of big global problems. We have no gravity, in a manner of speaking, no single country or cohesive alliance pulling us together. He calls it GZERO, because the big formations that used to exemplify leadership, G7, G8, G20, are no longer able or willing to stabilize and steer international policymaking. Even the attempt to scale up and bring more countries to the discussion table hasn't led to effective global action. And in an era of rapid globalization, the emergence of new superpowers, and a series of crises, what does it mean for everyone if nobody's in charge? To put it bluntly, it can be rough. Issues like climate change, refugee movements, financial instability, and health crises all demand cooperation. Yet many countries are too busy trying to solve their own domestic challenges to muster the energy or resources to lead on an international scale. Bremmer says that one of the major reasons big traditional powers, like the United States or Japan, and rising giants, like China or Brazil, aren't stepping in to fill this vacuum is that they have a massive laundry list of internal problems. They're exhausted by domestic political pressures such as government debt, rising healthcare costs, and, in the case of emerging powers, lifting entire populations out of poverty. Consider the United States. It needs to borrow billions of dollars every single day just to keep its budget afloat and meet its obligations. It has an aging population as well, which puts hefty demands on programs like Social Security and Medicare. Countries like Japan are in similar straits, grappling with an aging society, severe debt issues, and stagnant economic growth. That alone is enough to keep politicians and leaders busy without them trying to fix the entire world's problems. On the flip side, emerging economies such as Brazil, India, and China have in many respects done an admirable job of tackling domestic issues promptly, but they still have massive populations to care for, infrastructure to build, and living standards to expand. China may have a strong economy, but its per capita income is still significantly behind advanced Western countries. This means that pushing its middle class upward and staving off major social unrest is a primary concern for Beijing. When international summits roll around, we see that no one wants to accept responsibility for the painful transitions required to solve global challenges. Bremmer points to the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Summit as an example. The United States and France put pressure on rapidly emerging nations like China and India to adopt binding agreements on emissions cuts. Meanwhile, China and India argued that the advanced countries had spent decades or even centuries polluting the planet while building their own economies, so it shouldn't fall on the newest industrial powerhouses alone to make sacrifices. The older powers shot back that most future emissions will come from the emerging economies, so it's imperative that these populous countries join in large-scale reductions. This friction caused both sides to shrug and refuse to push for a meaningful deal. The result was a summit that ended in underwhelming pledges without a robust, enforceable global policy. That single scene at Copenhagen exemplifies the GZERO phenomenon, a vacant seat at the helm of the ship, so everyone's pointing fingers at one another while the clock ticks and environmental crises build in the background. As Bremmer discusses, this kind of worldwide standstill isn't confined to climate issues. It also affects how countries deal with skyrocketing food prices and environmental disasters, leading them to turn inward rather than seek collective solutions. Food crises can cause governments to institute food protectionism, where they'll ban certain exports or accuse other countries of contamination to keep prices manageable at home. When crop yields in Russia or Argentina drop due to drought or extreme weather, those governments might lock down exports to ensure their own population won't experience shortages. This kind of behavior, while it can temporarily calm domestic fears, makes the international community more fragile. Countries become wary of each other, foreign relations get tense, and global challenges, even those as mundane as plant diseases or trade disruptions, are seldom tackled as a team. Instead, each nation rattles off quick fixes that might deepen mistrust in the long run. So, with this GZERO environment in mind, Bremmer analyzes which countries might win and which might lose as we drift along. Because remember, some nations manage to profit from the chaos by staying flexible and forging partnerships widely, with no over-reliance on any single ally. Brazil is one such pivot state, according to Bremmer. It has strong relationships with a variety of partners from different parts of the globe, so if one collapses, it can pivot to another. For instance, it once leaned heavily toward trade with the United States, but over the last decade or so, China has become a key partner, purchasing substantial amounts of Brazilian commodities. Because Brazil can adapt swiftly, it's better positioned to ride the waves of zero unpredictability. Turkey has exhibited similar qualities, acting as a crucial hinge between the EU, the United States, and neighboring nations in the Middle East and Asia. In other words, the winners are often the countries flexible enough to remain afloat, even if the center of global economics or politics shifts away from old standbys. In contrast, countries that are too dependent or too rigid can find themselves losing ground. Japan, for example, is strongly tied to the United States for military and economic security. If the United States is bogged down by domestic issues and can't project stable leadership abroad, Japan might struggle to protect its own interests in a changing Asia, dominated more and more by China. Or take Mexico. Much of its economy is oriented toward tourism and oil exports, with the United States as a primary market and a vital source of immigration remittances. If the U.S. economy sneezes, Mexico can catch a cold. During an era when the U.S. might become more inwardly focused or struggle with partisan battles that leave foreign policy on the back burner, Mexico can't easily readjust its entire economy. That's how a zero world can turn certain countries, particularly those which rely on a single trade partner or military ally, into losers, at least until they find new ways to adapt. Urbanization, digital revolutions, and cross-border crises are all making it more and more obvious that we need broad cooperation. But according to Bremmer, GZERO is only a transitional stage. It won't last forever because eventually too many problems will remain unaddressed, and states may be forced to come to new agreements. But how might that final shift happen, and what forms of leadership could fill the vacuum? Bremmer outlines different scenarios based on whether China and the United States choose to cooperate. If the two do work together, one possibility is something like a G2, that is, a world order shaped predominantly by these two giants, leaving everyone else on the sidelines. Washington and Beijing are, after all, economically interlinked by trade and debt holdings. If they decided to put aside their rivalry and fix certain global dilemmas with a bilateral approach, they'd have the sheer economic clout to do it. Western European nations might resent being left out of the driver's seat, but if their economies can't match the scale of the Sino-American engine, they might have no choice but to accept a second-tier leadership role. However, if other states like Germany, Brazil, India, or even smaller but highly capable tech-savvy countries grow more powerful, we could see a GXX, which is a system where China and the US still cooperate more than they do now, but other powers actively join them in global leadership. Bremmer imagines this scenario might become real if there's a big enough crisis that clearly impacts every major state. He suggests, for instance, that a massive global-scale cyber attack that disrupts major industries in America, China, the EU, and so on might finally jolt leaders into forging an international problem-solving coalition. For as long as the crisis lasts, they'd cooperate to deal with the shared threat. The question is, would that cooperation outlive the specific crisis that caused it, or would each country drift back to its own priorities once the immediate danger passes? Alternatively, if China and the United States don't cooperate, two more scenarios arise. Under one scenario, the rest of the world's nations remain relatively weak, and we end up with Cold War 2.0. Instead of the old US versus USSR arrangement, we see the US and China acting as two separate orbits. Asian and African nations might cluster under China's economic influence, while NATO allies and Western powers remain committed to the United States. But because the US and China are so economically intertwined, it's difficult for them to lash out without damaging themselves, which is quite unlike the old Cold War, where the US and the Soviet Union didn't rely on each other's financial markets. This new Cold War would thus be more unpredictable and more complex. In the final scenario, if other states are strong enough even without China-US cooperation, we might see the world fracture into several vigorous regions. Perhaps Germany could dominate Europe's financial climate. Brazil might emerge as a de facto South American leader, and so forth. These regional powers might handle environmental or economic crises on a local or regional basis, but global-level collaboration would remain absent. This version of a world of regions might mitigate some smaller-scale problems, like sub-regional conflicts or trade deals, yet fail badly at big issues that cross all borders, like pandemics or climate disasters that require truly global coordination. All these potential futures revolve around the question, can we find the leadership we need to solve urgent cross-border challenges, or are we doomed to watch those problems pile up until they spark a crisis forcing us into action? That, in essence, is the puzzle at the heart of the GZERO phenomenon. Bremmer doesn't claim to know precisely which scenario will unfold, but he insists that the present vacuum isn't sustainable indefinitely. Sooner or later, the sheer weight of unresolved problems, a catastrophic environmental crisis, a massive cyber shutdown, or some other black swan-style event, will push major powers to either form alliances or face the consequences of letting everything spin out of control. In the meantime, what can you and I learn from all this? Well, it's likely that multinational corporations, tech entrepreneurs, and local communities will also have more to do with mitigating global problems, especially when national governments are distracted. Private initiatives might fill some of the gaps, whether through philanthropic efforts, international NGOs, or collaborative corporate projects that solve local issues. But even so, major undertakings, like stopping a runaway pandemic, call for a level of cooperation that only the biggest global players can marshal. In a GZERO environment, though, ironically, while everyone insists on sovereignty and standing alone, crises often don't respect borders or local sovereignty. That's the tension that Bremmer sees dominating early 21st century geopolitics. Where does this leave us as individuals or small communities? Understanding the GZERO concept might help us navigate the complexities of global markets, foreign relations, and emerging technologies. We may notice more deeply how certain nations that pivot and remain flexible are doing better, or that old alliances are withering in the face of unstoppable economic or demographic changes. We might read about Brazil or Turkey forging surprising relationships, or about Germany quietly calling the shots in Europe, and realize it's part of trying to survive in a zero world. And while we may wish for a single heroic force to unify the globe, that's not how events are unfolding right now. Ultimately, every nation for itself is a snapshot of the biggest risk in geopolitics today. We face daunting collective problems, but key leaders are too internally preoccupied to step up, so the rest of us have to wonder which scenario will emerge. Will we see the US and China put aside differences to lead? Will a monstrous threat drive a new GXX consortium? Or are we stumbling toward a new Cold War, or a world of fragmented, region-by-region leadership and clashing interests? The story of the next few decades might revolve around finding out, or suffering the consequences of not knowing. If you're intrigued to learn more, make sure to pick up your copy of Every Nation for Itself by Ian Bremmer from the link below. There's so much more detail and nuance in the full book, especially deeper case studies on which regions might rise to the top, how business interests play out beneath government policies, and what historical lessons we can draw from older periods of power vacuums. Ian Bremmer's insights will give you a stronger grasp of what makes geopolitics tick in the absence of a global anchor holding us all together. Now that we've walked through the big ideas and four main scenarios, it's up to us to watch how real-life events line up with Bremmer's predictions. Will we see deeper cooperation soon, or are these predictions just the beginning of an even more unstable phase in global affairs? Perhaps we'll only know for sure once a truly shocking catalyst triggers some fresh alignment of the powers that be. But either way, understanding the GZERO framework can keep us more alert to what's going on around the world and how quickly alliances can shift. Thanks so much for watching and tuning in to this summary. As always, if the themes in our discussion resonated with you, we highly encourage you to buy and read Every Nation for Itself to get the full scope of Ian Bremmer's analysis right from the source. It's an enlightening read that will double your understanding of how global politics works in our dizzyingly complex era. And if you enjoy this kind of deep dive into pivotal political and economic questions, subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what other books you'd like us to cover. Until next time, keep exploring, keep thinking globally, and remember, our world may feel leaderless, but knowledge and awareness are the first steps in figuring out how to make a difference. Don't forget to check out the link below to grab your copy of the full book and see for yourself just how Ian Bremmer envisions a path forward in a GZERO world.